Chapter 23, The Maya. While the Roman Empire was declining in Western Europe, the Maya were creating an advanced civilization in the Americas. Mayan civilization reached its height between 300 and 900 CE. During this time, Mayan culture spread over much of Mesoamerica, including part of present-day southern Mexico, Belize, and most of Guatemala, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. The landscape in which the Maya lived varied greatly. In the south, pine forests covered the mountain highlands. In the northern and central regions were rainforests, grasslands, and swamps. These areas are known as the lowlands. Thick jungle covered the southern part of the lowlands. This is where Mayan civilization reached its height development. Today, this area is called the Petén region of Guatemala. The Maya built their civilization in part on the ideas they inherited from a people called the Olmec. The Olmec lived in the jungle areas on the east coast of Mexico. Their civilization reached its peak between 1200 and 500 BCE. Like early civilizations in other parts of the world, the Olmec civilization was based on agriculture. By 2000 BCE, people in parts of Mexico had turned from hunting and gathering to farming as their main source of food. A particularly important crop was maize or corn. Farming allowed the Olmec to create permanent settlements. They established farming villages throughout the region. They also created trade routes that stretched for hundreds of miles. By 1400 BCE, the Olmec had a capital city that boasted palaces, temples, and monuments. They were the first Mesoamericans to develop large religious and ceremonial centers. They were also the first to use a solar calendar. The Maya would build on all these achievements. Three periods of Mayan civilization. Mayan civilization began to arise in eastern and southern Mexico around 2000 BCE. Historians divide the history of Mayan civilization into three main periods: pre-classic, classic, and post-classic. The long pre-classic period lasted from about 2000 BCE to 300 CE. During this time, the Maya farmed the land and lived in simple houses and compounds or groups of buildings. Gradually, the Mayan culture became more complex. As the Mayan population grew, settlements became larger. The Maya began constructing public buildings for governmental and religious purposes. About 50 BCE, they began to adapt the writing system of the Olmec and develop their own system of hieroglyphic writing. Mayan civilization reached its peak during the Classic period from around 300 to 900 CE. The achievements you will study in this chapter date from this time. During the Classic period, the Maya adapted and developed ideas they had learned from the Olmecs. For example, they improved on Olmec building techniques. Even though the Maya lacked metal tools and had not discovered the wheel, they built enormous stone cities that boasted elaborate and highly decorated temple pyramids and palaces. The Maya also built observatories for studying the heavens. They charted the movements of the moon, stars, and planets. They used their knowledge of astronomy and mathematics to create complex and highly accurate calendars. Mayan society during the Classic period consisted of many independent states. Each state had farming communities and one or more cities. At its height, the Mayan Empire included over 40 cities, including Tikal, Copan, Chichen Itza, and Palenque. Around 900 CE, the Classic civilization collapsed. The Maya abandoned their cities in the southern lowland area, and the great cities fell into ruin in the jungle. No one knows for certain why this happened. At the end of the chapter, we will look at some theories that may explain the mystery. To the north, on the Yucatan Peninsula, Mayan cities continued to prosper during the post-Classic period. This period lasted from about 900 to 1500 CE. During this time, the Maya continued their warfare and empire building, but they had fewer great artistic and cultural achievements. Even at the height of their empire, the Maya were not one unified nation. Instead, they lived in many city-states with separate governments. What united them as Maya was their common culture, their social system, languages, calendar, religion, and way of life. Let's take a closer look at some aspects of Mayan culture, starting with class structure. During the Classic period, the Maya lived in independent city-states like Tikal. Within each state, Mayan society was structured like a pyramid. The ruler of each city-state was at the top of the social pyramid. The rest of the Mayan society was organized in a series of layers below him. The highest authority in the state was the Halach Unirik, the Mayan word that means true man. He ruled the state with the help of his advisors. He decided when and where to go to war. The Mayan ruler was considered a god king. During religious ceremonies, he wore a headdress that was as tall as a person. When he died, or a son or other close male relative succeeded him. Mayan rulers were almost always men, but scholars believe that women had considerable influence, probably through family relationships. The next layer in the social pyramid was made of nobles and priests. They were the only members of Mayan society who knew how to read and write. The nobles served as officials and oversaw the administration of the states. They gathered taxes, supplies, and labor for projects like the construction of temples. Nobles led peasant armies in times of war. During battles, they wore elaborate costumes, including gold jewelry and animal robes made from the skin of jaguars. Priests were important because they maintained favor with the gods. Like nobles, they inherited their position from their fathers. Priests led rituals, offered sacrifices, and foretold the future. They were consulted to determine the best days for going to battle. In addition to their religious duties, priests were often mathematicians, astronomers, and healers. Although the Mayan economy was based mostly on farming, trade and crafts were also important. These functions were carried out by merchants and artisans. The Maya were accomplished traders. They traveled by sea, river, and well constructed roads to trade with other city states. Merchants in the lowlands imported valuable products from the highlands. These products included stones such as obsidian and jade, copal, a tree sap that Maya used as incense during religious ceremonies, and quetzals, birds with shiny green feathers used in headdresses. Mayan artisans made a wide variety of objects, many of them designed to pay tribute to the gods. They painted books on paper made from the bark of fig trees. Artists painted murals or wall paintings of Mayan life and important battles. They created sculptures for temples and decorative designs on palace walls. The Maya were also skilled weavers and potters. The peasants were the backbone of Mayan society. They worked hard on the land, growing maize, squash beans, and other crops to feed the population. During the growing season, men spent most of the day in the fields farming with wooden hoes. Women usually stayed closer to home, preparing food, weaving, and sewing. When they were not working on the land, peasants spent time building pyramids and temples. In exchange for their work, they sometimes attended royal weddings and religious events. Peasants also served as soldiers during wars. At the bottom of the social pyramid were the slaves. Slaves performed manual labor for their owners. Some were born into slavery, but free people sometimes became slaves. Some children became slaves when their parents sold them for money to feed the rest of the family. War prisoners of humble origin were made slaves. Those of higher rank were sacrificed to the gods. And some people were made slaves as a punishment for serious crimes. In general, slaves were not treated badly. Sometimes they actually had easier lives than peasants, depending on what job they did and where their masters lived. But slaves were not free to come and go as they pleased. Often they were sacrificed when their masters died. Now that we've looked at the Mayan culture structure, let's take a look at what daily life was like for the majority of the Maya, the peasants. In city-states like Copan, which is in present-day Honduras, Mayan peasants lived in one-room huts built of interwoven poles covered with dried mud. Several family houses were often grouped around a courtyard. A house containing the kitchen was often placed directly behind the main house. Peasant families worked hard, but ceremonies and rituals provided a break from work and a chance to honor important events. Life for Mayan peasant families was not easy. Mayan women rose before dawn to get the fire burning in the fireplace. With the help of her daughters, a Mayan woman cleaned the corn that had been boiled and left to soak and soften overnight. Then she set to work at the grinding stone, pounding corn into the meal. She patted the meal into tortillas, Spanish word that means little breads, or tamales, and cooked them over the fire. These might serve as the morning meal, or they might be saved for dinner. On special days, they might also have hot chocolate, a drink the Maya made from cacao beans. During the day, women and older girls cared for smaller children or the family's few animals like ducks and turkeys. They swept their homes and they gathered, spun, and wove cotton into cloth. Mayan fathers and sons ate their morning meal quickly before leaving to work the fields. When they weren't busy with the crops, men and boys hunted and trapped animals. They also helped construct large buildings such as palaces and temples. In times of war, peasant men served as soldiers. Although Mayan families worked hard, they also took time to celebrate the important events in their lives. The birth of a child was a time of rejoicing. As soon as possible after the birth, the family called in a priest to perform a ceremony much like baptism. The priest forecast the baby's future and gave advice to help guide the parents on raising the child. At 3 months of age, girls went through another ceremony. The number 3 was special to Mayan women because it represented the 3 stones of the fireplace. In the 3-month ceremony, the baby girl was introduced to the tools she would use throughout her life. Small items were placed in the baby's hands, such as tools for spinning and weaving, carrying water and cooking, and soaking and grinding maize. A similar ceremony was held for boys at 4 months of age. The number 4 was special to Mayan men. It represented the 4 sides of the plot of land where a boy would spend his life. The baby boy was given farmers' tools such as axes and planting sticks, and the spears, knives, and traps of a hunter. Another important ceremony in every Mayan child's life was the coming of age ceremony. Girls went through this ceremony at the age of 12 and boys at 14. The long ceremony involved confessions, cleansing with water, and reciting the rules of behavior. Finally, the priest cut a white bead from the boy's hair, and removed a string of red shells from around the girls' waists. Boys and girls had worn these symbols of innocence since they were quite young. The next big event for a Mayan youth was marriage. Men usually married around the age of 20, girls married when they were as young as 14. The bride and groom did not choose each other. Instead, marriages were negotiated by the village Atsanhab, the matchmaker. These negotiations were not simple. Families had to agree on how much food and clothing would be given to the bride's family. They also had to agree on the number of years a young man would work for his new wife's family. Once the details of a marriage were worked out, the villagers built a hut for the couple behind their home of the bride's parents. When the home was ready, the bride and groom put on clothing woven for the occasion. After a priest blessed the marriage, the villagers celebrated. Clearly, rituals and ceremonies were an important part of daily life to the Maya. Let's look more closely at Mayan religious beliefs and practices. Religious beliefs and practices. Religion was very important to the Maya. The Maya built their cities around ceremonial and religious centers. Their magnificent temple pyramids rose high above the jungle canopy, like mountains reaching into the sky. Temple plazas provided gathering places for people to attend rituals and ceremonies. Scholars have learned about the Mayan religion from studying present day Mayan practices, ancient artifacts, and documents written during the post classic period. Here are some of these things they have discovered.